I've actually been quite reluctant or avoiding. I've been avoiding Metagram quite a bit in my thinking because it was so painful to develop it or to model it out and get into the detail of it, of all these different sort of types. In that, sort of, I had to empathize so much with other people's perspective that I really sort of had to disconnect from myself so broadly. But I think the thing that I understand the least about Metagram is the stimulus. Also because the stimulus is so intrinsically interwoven with what it means to have a perspective. Yeah, the subconscious I link with the stimulus, I link with the subconscious is using the stimulus emotional tones, and it is the perspectival as one of the four P's. It's a nice, short and sweet way of describing what the subconscious is relative to the other sides of the mind. And it's interesting because I think that might be the most viable therapeutic tool that there is within my theory, perhaps, is that, maybe not so, but in terms of the end game, it becomes the final boss, it becomes the final frontier, in that it's perhaps, again, this needs to be taken with a slight pinch of salt because this might be dependent on guna type or circuit. Different circuits might follow a different formula, but I do really get the sense that the subconscious I call it the second side of, the superego I call the first side of the mind, the subconscious I call the second, and the unconscious is the third, and the ego is the fourth. But you see, the first side of the mind can almost, those primordial problems need to be solved in integration. So they can be solved in theory. They can be solved, I say that this is also the difference between being a theta clear. Being a theta clear is clearing up your superego, but being an actual clear is fixing the subconscious in some sense. And you kind of probably have to be a theta clear before you can actually process out your actual charge. But the actual charge, the actual brokenness of your psychology is really housed within the subconscious. And so the stimulus is really at the ground floor where all these problems really persist. And the problem is that how do you stop them from persisting? How do you freeze them in place so that you can work on them? So the stimulus has a kind of catch-22, and in trying to deal with that catch-22 and therapeutically dealing with it, then you keep on riling up the whole sort of bed of snakes, the whole unconscious and the whole superego then come back into stress. And it perhaps is that the subconscious is really quite elementally a simple container. It's a simple, it is a utilitarian functionary. It is a vessel of coming from the superego, and in some sense part of the magic of self-actualization, I think, is that although the subconscious on some level needs to be regarded as epistemologically prime, in its number 2 spot, it is in fact epistemologically prime. The ego is ontologically prior to it. So that this is the problem in this is a good, I think, way of summarizing the fundamental incongruity and the problems of developing integration and driving towards self-actualization, is that we have an ontological story and we have epistemological story which do not line up. They are not congruent. They are fundamentally contradictory, and this inconsistency manifests as an insolubility. An insolubility that leads you through metagram circuitry every time you try to computationally sort of hammer it out or steamroll it. And, it would be so easy if we could perhaps just sort of deal with the subconscious in isolation, which is not possible. So, as soon as we deal with the subconscious, we kick up all the other looming storms in all the other places, which I think can only be solved if you have enough preparatory work in culminating all your cognitive dissonance of all the sides of the mind into the inferior function of the ego. So the integration of the ego is necessary for the integration of the superego, which only is true in a kind of, in theory, in the epistemology of the ego. And in some sense, the ego, I think, is the house, is the seat of consciousness within the epistemological thread. Sorry, I think I just reversed my terminology there, unfortunately. Was I saying that rather it is the ego which is ontological, and the subconscious which is the seat of one's epistemology? Yeah, I guess you see, I just committed the thing that I was just talking about. These things become interchangeable and they get confused, and the one ends up subverting or displacing the other, because there is a common nexus between them. In that common nexus is a complexity of interdependence, in how the unconscious is dependent on the superego, and yet the subconscious is dependent on the ego, and therefore for the subconscious to house its epistemological seat of consciousness, it has to depend on the ontological prior working of the ego, and the ego has the converse perspective, or perhaps just the inverse, in that, so the ego could either get confused that actually no, it is the epistemological thread and the subconscious is the ontological thread, and or those labels are interchangeable themselves almost fundamentally, depending on which perspective you want to make prime, the subconscious perspective or the egoic perspective, although that itself is a bit of a misnomer if we regard the subconscious to be where all framings of perspective or sets of perspective are structured and held, contained within. But the ego contains prepositional, contemplative, immediate review. This is the mystery of the distinction between the subconscious and the ego, is that the ego is the audience of the subconscious. It's watching the subconscious like a film, and therefore it's outside of the time of the subconscious. The subconscious is in the immediate, whereas the view of, you see, this is also paradoxical. The ego, if you're watching a movie, the movie has already been filmed. The end of the movie already exists, but you haven't reached that point of review yet as you are viewing the film, as you're viewing the screen. So does the screen have time, or does the audience have time? That's, however you want to prepositionally describe that, it's up for grabs. So, the ego is doing the mechanics of prepositional contemplative viewing, but in some sense it's a master of time. The ego itself is conceptually above time or beyond time, but it always has to view things in a in the medium. It can't sort of be too callous with the conceptualization of time, because it's fixed in a fixed correlation in terms of some mechanic or dynamic of time. Because if it gives itself a master, a control of time to such a degree, it's going to diminish the ability of its ability to interrogate or witness so what it does to time, it's going to have a parallel reflection in terms of how subconscious treats the concept of time. So there's almost the link between the link between the emergent response and the stimulus, or the link between which is that's perhaps a more complicated issue, but it's also related between the link of the subconscious and the ego. Is something like a consistent or a coherent treatment of time that is negotiated or at least settled between these two sides of the mind, and in some sense, this is where the shadow of the unconscious is always prone to being entered into or sent as a plague against you for and sometimes unconscious shadows are probably inescapable, because there is a developmental arc that has to be journeyed. Anyway, so another way of putting it is that prepositional contemplative views are interchangeable on some level with perspectival structures or sets of framing. And because the prepositional therefore is interrelatable or interchangeable, but in a kind of transcribable fashion, not in a direct interchange, but there is a direct impact and a direct correlative impingement one to the other. And in that correlative interplay also, there are mechanics that impinge on other sides of the mind or activate other sides of the mind to have sympathetic triggered issues, or sympathetic triggered pathologies from incongruence. But it's not that some pathological states, I think, can't exactly, pathology can't necessarily be avoided. It needs to be tasted, it needs to be tested, it needs to be understood from the inside. And sort of without the spirit of investigation and let's say some deep call towards integration or self-knowledge or something like that, obviously we are prone to disintegration or spiraling free fall or something like that, or vortexing into a kind of oblivion. But which is why all of this is generally covered by mystery. And, obviously it's very sad when people are stuck in the wrong mystery, or in a mystery that is unlikely to precipitate anything useful, because it's just a kind of a reiterated manifestation of a recurring dramatization which has not been cottoned onto, which has not, when you are watching the same movie in your ego forever and ever, and you don't realize it's the same movie because it's a slightly different narrative. The plot is slightly different, but thematically it's exactly the same. It's just another variant. Anyway, now I might be sending people towards the meditation on variance, although that sort of already happens now naturally with people, that they are faced with that when they see their use of the internet, and their use of technology, and their use of social media, that now perhaps it's quite a healthy way to see the recurring patterns that one is prone. And in some sense, the toxicity that we face in the modern era is merely because people want to be dignified in their addictions. Instead of working on them, they want to find justification or a kind of label of dignity for their malfeasance, essentially, or their monotony. They don't only want to be suggested with more of the same type of content that they like binging, but they want to be told as well that they are clever or bright or moral or virtuous for that kind of indulging. Anyway. And that might be because the mystery that they have to work with is not deep enough to actually console the human condition, or at least to propel it towards proper edification or development or maturity. And people are misled. I mean, people are misled by the world. They are misled by false doctrine. They are misled by many things. I was going to give an example of perhaps the most misleading thing is something like nihilism, something like the reluctance or the retreat from the idea that one can have a justified understanding. Essentially, that you just kind of settle on a kind of hard skepticism philosophical framework that, well, the only thing that you can ever come up with is a beautiful rationalization. And you can rationally, technically be correct that you can reduce everything into a rationalization, but the reduction of everything into a rationalization doesn't mean that that is what it is in essence or fundamentally. And that blind faith error, where the skeptic is actually making one of the most sort of conceited and impudent claims on all of objective reality in order to settle on his cynical, skeptical view on things, and people are misled into this. They're misled into this because in places where justice simply means the rule of man, where it's just a contest of rationalizations and updating rationalizations with different rationalizations and tests of rationalization, and you get very moral. I mean, I see a lot of these cases in America, these court cases, and I really just think, what a disgusting, reprehensible justice system with so few principles. In fact, I mean, they're not really principles. They're just sets of rationalization. And, as soon as something looks morally indictable or morally unsound, then they scurry back to the legislature to try to create a nicer looking rationalization to cover the bloody mess. Where's the reasoning in that to depend so much on democracy for justice, to define justice? Do you have no republic? It is it a corruption of the word justice if people think that there are only myriad possibilities of rationalization, and that they might be, and that the only thing that mediates the different myriad possibilities of rationalization is some kind of loose fucking consensus from the mob, or some kind of hard and fast rule of thumb, some lowest common denominator that people must be happy to be plied with. That if it's good enough for the collective, it's good enough for me. This kind of, people that have given their soul to their cultural identity or their group identity. Race itself. This is a terrible term. I could start a new race. I could say all my descendants are everybody else is another race, and I am the father of a new race. Any individual could be such, could be considered such. Race is, I guess, whatever you want to. Identity really is such a fickle thing. It means whatever you should want it to mean. However you should like to think about it, is a kind of claim that you might make about identity and race. Gender is a lot harder, or sexuality is a lot harder, because in some sense you have a dog in the fight. So it's harder to be objective or reasonable about issues of gender, because it's corresponding to an activity that you are in the process of navigating. So it has to do with tropes of existence that are fundamental to likely decisions that individuals are going to make, if you at least concede that reproduction or procreation is an element of the human condition. It is almost a kind of essential kind of nature of some kind of living, of the living. At least is a I don't want to get into a table thumping petulance, so perhaps I won't try to dignify that with more rationalization, because that's what I'm trying to do, is signal something within the medium, but essentially I would ground this properly from reason in terms of the necessity of a good hope, and ideally one can hope that the responsible impediments that individuals might make in order to impede themselves from procreating that those impediments can be overcome, in the long arc of improving our abilities and capacities to understand problems and to even solve them. And therefore we can arrive at something like a universal ideal of procreation, at least in a principled way, or from a kind of categorical translation or exemplification of our principles from reasoning, unless one, sort of conforms to a kind of fatalism or fatalistic worldview that then allows you the excuse to indulge in rationalization, and post hoc, kind of tailoring of evidence to entrench one's views, and the sympathy that one should garner for having such commonplace views, which, is something obviously that I have very little respect for, because that is essentially the conduit through which all evil, in some sense, is inherited or passed on by nascent people who I certainly blame for their complicity. In a wicked world. Anyway, it's not nice to sort of to pontificate on such judgmentalness or moral condemnation, but because sort of things are forgivable where they can be pedagogically reformed and sort of but people who think that they have developed an ammunition of sympathy, really loom large in the world to become a contingent of a dominion made of a legion of rationalizers who can rationalize and lend the consensus of their rationalization of their negative value of requiring sympathy and demanding sympathy of something, and can lend this weight in a kind of associative way that can link up with any manner of irrationality and injustice and sloppy and evil. Love of the darkness. And certainly, the problem that I have is not that people get in this condition. It's that they are also misled by the power systems and the power structures of the world, by the bad examples of justice. That, I think, is a structural corruption, an institutionalized corruption, which we certainly do not need. And we had made great progress in creating a luminary example of secular reasoning in the only country in the world that actually truly had the rule of law, South Africa. But then it was betrayed and lost, and it still needs to be recovered, although that seems more and more unlikely. But that is the true answer to all of these problems. Laws of general application that are in principle complete and that are properly reasoned from first principles, with enough reasoning, enough values in how reasoning needs to be comported in order to conserve those basic values and principles, so that justice is a standalone, independent tool to be used, speaking truth to power, as it were, but in a way that also finds a verdict to fall on the side of conserving those values and principles, but those values and principles have been discarded. We have given up laws of general application with the invention of the hideous corruption of the governmental prerogative, and so the sub-clauses of the Constitutional Limitations Clause has gone unapplied by the Constitutional Court, for which everyone on the South African Constitutional Court bench should be impeached for not immediately rectifying this injustice, the scandalous betrayal and murder of the Constitution, in the abrogation of the fundamental value of non-racialism, which has been allowed to create a toxic political football, which has further misled people into what can only be described as the most reprehensible form of cultural corruption. Anyway, the enemies of my project loom large, but perhaps the hope is not yet completely smothered. I have often thought what it says about me if my constitution is overtly destroyed. It has been implicitly defiled, but if it is at some point overtly destroyed, I would wager that it cannot be overtly destroyed. I say that, I mean that as an article of faith. I believe that my actions and my work cannot be undone, but I do not know what that means in material terms, in worldly terms. I do not know if that means that the name of a country will dissolve, but a constitution will preserve itself in some form, perhaps towards some truer form. But it is perhaps true that some provinces within South Africa I can't even say it. I think it's not true. I would like to think that the Constitution cannot recede from any territory that has become subject to it, even if its court has been corrupted by partisan political ideology and an overt ideology that blatantly destroys the content of the Constitution, that they have radically reinterpreted to suit their political masters, and but I mean, there is such an egregious departure from the legal tradition of this country, a legal tradition that even stood up against apartheid. In the drive to reinterpret our Constitution to be something like the American Constitution, which it is nothing like the American Constitution, as the American Constitution is really not fit for a civilization. It's fit for a democracy. It's not fit for a republic. It makes the rule of law impossible. It hinges everything on democracy. It delivers justice squarely into the hands of the rule of man and dissolves the rule of law into a toxic politics of moral grandstanding, of which a supreme constitution in the South African sense was certainly meant to upend that wicked way of the world. But it has been disposed of for political expedience, or at least for the mediocre machinations of people that do not deserve to be constitutional court judges. Because they do not understand the Constitution, and perhaps because they believe that they can supplement the Constitution with their own ideological preferences and spin, even at the egregious misapplication and forgetfulness of their fundamental mandated duty. They have already subverted their function with an idolatry of racialism and politics, and their excuse is that we won't even look at the issue of inconsistency with the Constitution because a democratically legitimated policy is by definition beyond the scope of the government to assess, because the semantic wording gives government the role to do this function. Therefore, we're going to hand it off to the democracy, and they can do whatever the democracy wants in that subject matter. I mean, it's scandalous just how pathetic and stupid, just how, I mean, it can't even be argued against, because it's just so on its face. The non-reasoning, the absolute embarrassing abrogation of duty. I mean, it is scandalous beyond. It angers me to the point where I would threaten these judges with the impeachment from my court, because that would be the only extraordinary measure that could be possible, is that I would interrogate in an exchange. I mean, I would certainly be in contempt of their court, but they would be in contempt of my court, and I would leverage the case of the necessary impeachment of these miscreants, of these wicked people who are inconsistent with the Constitution and who have abrogated their duty, and their only excuse is that they have the title to do so, is that they are supposedly, ostensibly constitutional court judges. They are no such thing. They are pretenders. We need a new constitutional court. Because we do not have one at all. And their charade, their ideological tokenism and representation, where they have obviously been chosen according to this corrupt and wicked racialist ideology, and which they can then only continue to promulgate the same disgusting pretense of normalization and constitutional rule when they are themselves avatars of a wicked and anti-constitutional mindset. They are imposters of the worst kind. And I think that if I was before them, I would certainly curse them during my impeachment of them. And whether or not the bailiff or the officer tasked with removing an unruly person who is in the midst of prosecuting judges who are simply not judges. They are wicked and evil children of a wicked and evil prophet. And under the valence of the false prophet, under the guidance of the false prophet, they have destroyed democratic illiteracy. They have destroyed an open liberal democracy, and they have entrenched a democratic illiteracy in the poisoning and the institutional corruption of our constitutional jurisprudence. But they have poisoned the water. They have entrenched democratic illiteracy in this country. They have entrenched a liberalism. They have entrenched racialism. They are even symbols of this itself, in not resisting their egregiously reprehensible process of appointment. They have sullied the reputation of the court itself. They have sullied the virtue and the merit of the court itself. In fact, even they have done other things which I find also incredibly reprehensible. The Chief Justice should never be the President of the Constitutional Court. I do not want to see the President of the Constitutional Court rubbing shoulders with politicians and fulfilling some kind of political function around politicians that is itself a distasteful misuse of the constitutional prestige. But you can see how they have translated this into they have translated the Constitution into a pageantry of semantic game playing. And they do not even fulfill their duty anymore, so much as that they fulfill this vicarious external locus of moral judgment. Supplementing everyone's common sense view of obvious topics. But I guess, this is what's necessary in order to give dignity to disgusting institutions like the South African Human Rights Commission, which is essentially a Gestapo-esque kangaroo court. Bread and circuses. But to see it being done on the topic of justice, on the subject of justice, it's anyway. I don't even call for punishment. I don't care about punishment, but it should immediately stop. If it does not immediately stop, with any of the inkling or the knowledge that this is an overt betrayal of the supreme law of the land, these people are guilty of the highest of crimes, of constitutional damages, which I have, in past recordings, I've slightly misspoken on this topic, because I have said that these people should be found guilty of what is essentially a crime of dishonesty. That's obviously incorrect. It shouldn't be called a crime of dishonesty. It should be called something else, but it should have the same impact as a crime of dishonesty, in the sense that you cannot be an officer of the court if you're found guilty of a crime of dishonesty. You cannot be a trustee or a director if you're found guilty of a crime of dishonesty. But people who commit things like constitutional damages, and I've created a draft bill of hate speech or that describes and defines the offense of hate speech or constitutional damages, because that's what hate speech should be considered as. Otherwise you've got other laws to cover it, like crimen injuria. You don't need hate speech to cover crimen injuria. But essentially, campaigning for the removal of somebody else's constitutional rights is unlawful. It's inconsistent with the Constitution. How would you ever go about doing that? You can just see in the expropriation without compensation process, you can just see how far people have strayed into this fascistic politics. You cannot campaign for the removal of constitutional rights. The Constitution cannot be amended that way. It just cannot. Because to amend the Constitution that way, you would have to draft a bill in Parliament. You would have to campaign for it, which would already be unlawful. You would have to draft a bill, which would already be unlawful. You would have to pass such an unlawful bill that is inconsistent with the Constitution, and then that inconsistent bill would have to be measured against the limitations clause. And if it fails the limitations clause, it doesn't matter how many people voted for it. It's unlawful. It's inconsistent with the Constitution. It doesn't get to amend the Constitution. The only form of amendments that that can be made to the Constitution are additions, not subtractions. You cannot subtract from the supreme law, because then it's not the supreme law anymore. It's fucking obvious. Everything must be consistent with the supreme law. Democracy is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. Then you live in a supreme democracy, not in a constitutional supremacy. It's fucking simple. It's very simple. And you can see how they've orchestrated the expropriation without compensation. How they even had to set it up and campaign around it and supposedly try to collect a democratic mandate for it, and how that has been concocted and contrived through political theatre, essentially, and specious political arguments by fascists, and falsely framing the issue and creating a false dilemma around the necessity to amend the Constitution by having reductions made to the Constitution. And all the while, the Constitutional Court did nothing in the face of all of this supreme anti-constitutional propaganda, which they sat by and did nothing about. They are useless. They are worse than useless. They are not judges. They are political, partisan plants. They have been planted there with their poisonous ideology, with their anti-constitutional ideology. And we sit with a corrupted, institutionally corrupted system. It is just, it's beyond. We live in Weimar Germany with the Nazis controlling the education system and the Nazis controlling the courts before Kristallnacht. That's where South Africa is right now, essentially, culturally and politically. And what is worse is that Germany didn't have the South African Constitution. Weimar Germany did not have the South African Constitution, which clearly made these things unconstitutional and illegal. But we do have that today in South Africa. So we have people propagating hate speech and anti-constitutional propaganda, and the courts allow public funds to go towards these corrupt institutions that continue to promulgate and proselytize this hate speech and anti-constitutional propaganda. These people are morally equivalent to the people that promulgated apartheid. The Constitutional Court judges are just as bad, and the politicians as well, that have played hollow lip service to non-racialism while they have utterly betrayed it. And they do nothing to uphold the constitutional line, and they have murdered our Constitution. And they glaze over this, and they scapegoat because they have a bank of consensus around sympathy and around what things truly mean or something like that. And they have hysterical, irrational, as well as unreasonable arguments. But even on the face of it, you can only make it rational if you completely have a blind eye to any kind of reasonable way in which things actually should operate and how they line up to values and fundamental notions of the rule of law and laws of general application. And you can see now how law itself, I mean, all the racialist laws are by definition not laws of general application. I mean, it's a basic fucking standard. It's written in Section 1 of the Constitution, laws of general application. How many laws do we have that are not laws of general application? It's so fucking simple. And they can't even do the simplest fucking functionary of a constitutional court. In fact, they are the heralds of the corruption of laws of general application. We have deviated so far from that standard. There is no excuse. They have helped cultivate this toxic political football. And their only excuse is, well, the Americans do this kind of shit show. The Americans have this kind of mediocre justice system, so we've imported the same institutional corruption into our structure. Because we can, well, the Americans are, we're just like the American system. We have the same kind of justice system. We have the same kind of constitution. They've imported the American injustice and the American rational, skeptical, troll, game-playing, political hucksterism and charlatanism and these are not judges. They have South Africa was the only country that, on theory, in theory, on paper, we had solved all of these problems. And for political, partisan, ideological, racialist filth, they destroyed it. And they can't open their eyes to their own corruption, because to do so would mean that they would recognize that they do not belong in the seats that they occupy, because the procedure that appointed them was wholly corrupted from the start, morally corrupted. And it is that moral corruption which is the true source of the governmental corruption or state corruption that we suffer from in general, but it is the moral corruption which gives disguise and cover to all of this, and these people are children of that moral corruption, and so they have no genuine self-esteem, and they can only protect themselves with this disgusting ideological racial consciousness and instrumentalization and normalization of a racialist dogma which is so disgusting and anti-constitutional. It is very clear that these people are not judges. They have disowned their own dignity. They do not deserve to be treated with dignity because they are criminals. They have criminally conducted anti-constitutional damages. And they continue to proselytize and to broadcast anti-constitutional lines of reasoning, ideological, political positions. These are the kinds of people that, if we ever have a Nuremberg trial in this country, because things escalate further into discord and injustice, and maybe that's what history needs. Maybe history needs black Nazis, black fascists, so that then at the end of that we can say, you see, black people can be just as morally inferior as white people. And therefore, when we have these imposter judges, that we can put them shoulder to shoulder with the genocidal maniacs and the other people who have committed these crimes against humanity that have already occurred. We are morally... The betrayal of the South African Constitution is on moral grounds a crime against humanity, because we had the solution to all of these problems, and it has been destroyed, it has been devastated. And that itself requires justice. That itself requires the same kind of sentencing that was handed out to people in the Nuremberg trials. And these people said, I was just following orders. Well, what can these people say? That they were just following the law? No, they can't say that. They betrayed the law. The first duty is to the supreme law, and they have betrayed that law. They are guilty. I have tried them in my court, and I find them guilty. And I believe that my court is eminently reasonable, and I have perhaps not delineated the full case out, but I think it is clear as daylight. I've gone over enough that it's obvious, I believe. And the kinds of pathetic excuses that they might raise in defense of their indefensible position and indefensible so-called judgments and decisions would be of the kind that, well, everybody else cottoned onto this disgusting racialist ideology. Well, fuck you for falling in to the disgusting consensus that was conspired by academics, by tertiary education institutions that were themselves corrupted first, just because you could create this toxic consensus, and because no one defended the Constitution. And when applications were made to label things anti-constitutional propaganda and to make sure that no public funds were given that case in the Cape Town High Court, which was badly decided by a High Court judge who did not want to wade into the political arena, who failed to defend the Constitution, was the beginning of a snowball that we are now, well, now there are no snowballs, because now we are boiling in the illiberalism of the hellfire of that insidious and perhaps innocuous reluctance to defend the Constitution. Because essentially, under the cover of so-called academic freedom, academic freedom is not beyond the morality of the supreme law of the land and the fundamental values of the South African Constitution. But that is how these people cloaked their disgusting views in the pretension of intellectual authority, in the credentials of academics. Well, they have a title, therefore it's a respectable view to take. That's what the Nazis said, essentially. They said, I was just following orders. And the Nazis were still tried. And they were still sentenced while they were following orders. I mean, that has taken a separate, taken on a separate life in this time, in this epoch. It's no longer orders. Well, they are also orders now in a lot of institutions, in a lot of corrupted institutions. Anyway, I guess I should stop repeating myself. It's a simple enough sort of point. But, sort of following the trend, so you're not going to follow the order, but you're going to follow the fad, the fashion, the intellectual fashion of a whole bunch of miscreants, of immoral people that have no principles, because they all agree with their disgusting rationalization of their disgusting ideology. Well, I guess if you're going to be a monster, it's good to do it as a group, because then at least then you can redefine your monstrosity as virtue, and you can then indict everybody else who doesn't agree with you, and create this disgusting democratic pigsty of essentially that is no longer going to be open and liberal. It's going to be a slow boil into fascism, which we have already essentially courted, which we already toy with. People openly campaigning for the demolishing of the Constitution. Let me just say one extra point of argument, which is that in substantiation of my grander claims, or my greater, broader claim, is that the semantic device which the judges use to justify a governmental prerogative in terms of racialist legislation is that they said that it is fundamentally justifiable in a democratic society because the democracy voted for the party that is implementing this policy. But we do not live in a democratic society. We live in a liberal democracy. And there is something that is generally understood and generally known about, which is called the liberal intolerance paradox. And therefore, just because intolerance of a certain kind is democratically founded, or democratically premised, or democratically legitimated, doesn't mean that it is legitimate within a liberal democracy and an open liberal democracy which is constrained by constitutional supremacy. And the measure of whether things fall into the category of essentially breaking liberal democracy by indulging in a kind of intolerance which essentially breaks the openness and the liberalness in a society, in some sense is, well, in our law, it's how consistent something is with the Constitution, which means that you can never overlook the subclauses of the limitations clause. If you use the limitations clause ever, you must use the subclauses of the limitations clause. You cannot use the opening paragraph and semantically work yourself out of actually using the entire clause. If you even read the subclauses of the limitations clause, they are general formulations that are in some sense philosophical subcomponents of the general conception of law, of what a law of general application is in itself. They are in a reasoned, principled, they are the principal components of what definitionally a law of general application must be, must conform to in the context of constitutional supremacy. The subclauses of the limitations clause in the Constitution are not numbered, they are lettered. In some sense, to use the term subclause is to usually it infers that they are numbered subclauses, in the sense that when a subclause is numbered, it is a distinct and independent avenue of interrogation, or it's a category of a subject matter. It's a subcategory which is its own distinct province, its own distinct realm, that may or may not be applicable. But the lettered subclauses in the limitations clause are in some sense not distinct cases of things that need to be considered. They all must always be considered. They all have answers. In every case, they can all be answered, and one can make ascertainments to each of those lettered subclauses. In fact, they are intrinsic to the reading of the limitations clause. They are the limitations clause, enumerated in each necessary component. They're not independent components. And I mean, the wording of the limitations clause is even clear that they must be taken holistically in the round, and essentially all of these things must find their correct determination in terms of how they impact each other. But essentially, what I'm just trying to say is that when the subclauses are lettered, they are part of the wording. They are intrinsically part of the wording of the section. Section 36 includes the lettered subclauses, and they cannot be excluded. They cannot be overlooked. They cannot be waved aside because of democracy. They are the guardian and the criterion by which you can even have the conception of law. You have to run all of those lettered subclauses, and you have to make a determination on the combination of those things. If you are blanketly disregarding one of the lettered subclauses, you are not using the limitations clause at all. You are doing your own witchcraft, your own narrative witchcraft, your own idolatry, your own suppression of the Constitution. Okay, I have perhaps this argument, this technical distinction between numbered subclauses and lettered subclauses is perhaps a facile and a weak way of getting my point across, but I think that there might, I didn't argue it that well, that there is a technical distinction between the lettered subclauses and the numbered subclauses in the Constitution, but that is how I wrote them. That is actually how I envisaged the proper contemplation of these wordings in my authorship of this document, an authorship which there is little historical evidence for, but there is historical evidence for, and it is obtainable, but it's not at my hand, but it's in the white paper of in the first official recording of what would come to be the interim constitution. There is evidence of my authorship, but it does require it has to be pointed out. It's not obvious, but anyway, I've described exactly how it's discernible in other recordings. I'm not going to repeat it here because it's slightly tenuous, but maybe I should, for completion's sake, just say, but it has a very obscure opening paragraph, and it has a very obscure closing paragraph. It has an introductory paragraph, and it has a concluding paragraph. And the introductory and concluding paragraph is slightly strangely worded, and the reason why it is strangely worded is because it has been contorted to contain a secret message, and that secret message is my name. In the opening paragraph, in a sequence of words, the first letter of each of these words is my first name, and in the closing paragraph, there is a sequence of words in which the reading of the letters in those words render my surname. And that is the tenuous historical evidence that exists of my authorship of the Constitution, which is... Anyway, it's not. Maybe I'm a delusional person. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm a maniac. But I think this does not detract from my general legal arguments on this matter, which are true in any case. As a further addendum, I want to sort of go back and clean up 2 points that I was sort of raising, or there are things that I've been thinking about in general, just in terms of how to express or to talk about these topics, because they are connected to the kind of the cultural rationalization and moral degeneration that we suffer from. And, I was talking about race, and I just wanted to make the point that essentially in how an individual treats other individuals, race is very easily a kind of philosophical, universal, moral kind of benchmark as to how reasonable a person you are. How you treat the topic of race is very subjectively up to your own decision about how you want to consider these issues, because it is so easy to essentially arbitrarily include yourself or exclude yourself from association with another kind of with the racial grouping by definition is essentially a kind of residue of pure subjective sentiment and interpretation. You know, you can almost philosophically decide how you want to treat that issue. Whereas, so this makes non-racialism, I think, much more natural and much more easily taught and morally educated on that topic. It's very accessible to everyone, I think. Non-racialism is fundamentally easy, whereas non-sexualism is not as easy, is not anywhere near as easy, because we are all actively in a sexual embodiment, or in terms of, generally speaking, within our purposes in life, we are going to be orientated towards some kind of goal, which is usually going to be, it's not going to be gender neutral. People aren't, you know, you can't legislate or expect, and it's certainly not practical, because essentially there are differences between relationships that are comprised of different biological sexes. And if someone has the goal of procreation, not all kinds of coupling are equal. I mean, they can be made on some level, they can be seen as equal in some figurative or metaphorical sense, but materially they don't all have the same features. And these features are not just abstract philosophical things to think about. You are, generally speaking, the ordinary person is going to be confined to having to interface with other people with the category of biological sex being relevant. You know, it's not, it is essentially, it's a pertinent material reality that we have to contend with, and according to most people's purposes. I mean, obviously, if you commit yourself to a solitary life in which you have already sort of categorically barred yourself from caring or wanting or desiring, you know, a hope in having a relationship that will produce biological progeny, which is, you know, just for almost for natural reasons in some sense, one can imagine why that is going to be essentially, that would never be the norm in any society comprised of biological agents and entities that have certain basic requirements in order to create reproduction of the members of that society. So, you know, basically, it's a fact of life, essentially. I mean, is another way of putting it. And this fact of life has implications in terms of activities that individuals are themselves, you know, especially in the younger portion of one's life, in terms of courtship or in engaging in the sexual marketplace. And look, the analogy, because in some sense, you know, I mean, this is why the theory of evolution, and or at least Darwinism and selective pressures and those sorts of ways of modeling reality are very psychologically prone to being adopted as frameworks of a kind of pseudo understanding of an external locus of control. They can be used to rationalize and create a web of interpretation that seemingly has an answer to every question. You know, you can use, for example, evolutionary theory to describe why people will be more loyal to other people that share more genetic ingredients with them, because essentially then, because if you, you know, that you would risk your life to save 4 cousins, but you won't risk your life to save 1 cousin. But you might risk your life to save a brother, but you wouldn't risk your life to save a second cousin twice removed or something like that, because it's all about essentially, and in some sense the inherent status that you seemingly inhabit or that you have inherited from your material embodiment. This is almost the theme around which identity politics has been able to culturally advance itself through predominantly the ideology of intersectional feminism, which is essentially, in a large way, it's based on sort of gaming the social conventions which you see, there are peculiar reasons why femininity ordinarily presents itself as the conventional set of instruments which feminism itself is deeply entrenched into using, and essentially why that this is a kind of toxic. The Greeks would have called this eris, the discordia. They would have called this is the temperamental, destructive side of femininity, which can have some useful place in society, because essentially when a woman says, no, this is not good enough, and rejects and says, no, I would rather have disorder because I'm not happy with the current order, bring me a new order, bring me a new status quo, bring me a new structure to work from. If women make that kind of dissatisfaction but have no inclination to stipulate what would be acceptable, when they reject with no achievable substitute which they are encouraging or suggesting should be, if they, you can't just say no. You have to say no because I would prefer something else. But when the thing that is being stated as the preference is essentially a fundamental incoherence or a fundamental paradox, then you've got a never-ending cycle of repudiation that leads nowhere, and you end up essentially, and this is what feminism essentially has done, is that it is aggravating itself and it is scapegoating the blame. It's misidentifying that it is the cause of its own dissatisfaction. And so it's just escalating accusations against other entities for not bringing it what would be satisfactory. But in some sense, the problem is because what is being stated as the coherent resolution to these problems is not a coherent resolution. So in some sense, it's like saying, bring me a square circle, otherwise I won't be happy with you, and you are hurting me because you have failed to bring me a square circle. And so you say, no, you've brought me a square and you've brought me a circle, but it's not a square circle, so go away. You're wasting my time, and why are you trying to bring me counterfeits? I've told you what I want a square circle. And just because you can utter the word square circle doesn't mean it's coherent, doesn't mean it makes sense, doesn't mean it has any reason behind it. It can't be properly substantiated. It can't be delivered. So the demand to be delivered something that is essentially conceptually incoherent and fundamentally impossible. So how do you explain to someone there's no such thing as a square circle? You've got an error in your thinking. Please reason from principles. Please, let's talk about it. Let's discuss it. No. You are trying to, and I'm doing a rendition of what their response is to this, which goes something like this: No, stop trying to distract me and trying to say, stop trying to gaslight me. I've asked for a square circle. Don't try to argue me out of what I want. I know what I want. I want a square circle. I'm telling you what I want. And just because they utter the words, and they've got an associative web of rationalization of how this connects with their general narrative. You see, you didn't bring me a square circle when I asked you for one, and now you're trying to tell me that it doesn't exist. You're obviously playing games with me. Stop lying to me. Of course there's a square circle. Go, you keep on telling me that there's no such thing. Well, you're obviously not trying very hard to understand what I'm trying to say to you. So it's this constant escalating doubling down on what is fundamentally, just a kind of a mess. And so you have discord that will never be satisfied. And in some sense, how can you deal with this? Well, you can't really. You have to segregate against it. You have to say, no, you're crazy. We're not going to pander to this. We cannot be forced to tolerate this because, well, we can tolerate you within some bounds, but you can't be the leader of an institution. You can't try to run things. You can't try to implement these square circle double standards in our society. You're going to cause messes, and you're going to cause injustice, and you're going to cause essentially a fascistic groupthink over the point of vindicate, because essentially in how you prove that you deserve a square circle and how you want to promote and have activism around that, you're going to, at the first point of your activism, you're going to vindicate that you have been willfully undermined by these people who don't bring you a square circle. So the first point that you make is that the people that won't bring you a square circle are evil people. And so if that is your proximate first priority in your activism, then you never touch on the question of actually ever if it's possible to deliver a square circle or not, because you're just kind of trying to scapegoat the people who are detracting from your project. Never mind that it's an impossible project, you've sort of deferred that issue. You're just sidelining that issue. You're tabling it until after you punish the people who are getting in your way. And so it becomes more about vindicating its own position than it is about the underlying substance. And you can tell people that are fixated on this kind of doubling down on their own rationalization, because they think that just because they can get a piece of the puzzle that is in a kind of rational, that they can talk about a narrative, they can construct a narrative that has a kind of rationality built in it. Well, it doesn't mean that it's coherent just because it's rational. Rationality is just self-consistency. Just because something is self-consistent doesn't mean that it's reasonable or coherent or self-coherent. It's not coherent. So just because you can say, I want a square circle, doesn't mean that you're being self-coherent. Doesn't mean that you are being reasonable. Just means that, well, you can claim to be self-consistent, and you can claim to be rational, and you can claim that, well, your understanding of the world, which is essentially a narrative, is a rational narrative, but it's not a proper understanding, and it certainly is not an understanding that can be substantiated. In fact, how they substantiate how they pretend to have an understanding is they blame everyone who doesn't agree that they have a proper understanding. They say, well, if you don't think I have a proper understanding, then you're an evil person and you need to be essentially gulagged or Auschwitzed. You need to be disposed of. You need to be segregated. And this is why we need to segregate from them, because they will turn society into fascism. You cannot be tolerant of that kind of intolerance. This is the liberal intolerance paradox. Fascists have to be taken out of positions of control and power where they can adjudicate over people. It's improper for people that are intolerant in this way to adjudicate over people. They must be removed. And essentially, you also keep them out of institutions by having institutional filters that are based on reasonableness and coherence, and are essentially predominantly the biggest guiding light to this is the rule of law, is the justice system. But, essentially, sexuality is such the topic of sexual identity and people's, let's say, their lack of being able to have an independent self-esteem and their dependence on a kind of external validating groupthink that will bestow upon them a kind of intrinsic dignity that they don't themselves own, that isn't founded within themselves, but is founded in a narrative or in a rationalization, then forces them to have that rationalization validated and to associate with other rationalizations that will link up with it and create essentially a false trust culture, a culture that has no fundamental integrity, but instead has an ideological trust that if you break the ideological trust, then you will be banged down. You will be stampeded, like a hammer will come down, and the nail that sticks up will be banged down. That is how this corrupt trust, dogmatic orthodoxy rules things. And the only thing that can really speak truth to power is essentially having a proper justice system that is the model of morality that then can be educated. People can be morally educated, and that just a civics education in a decent justice system will give people a good enough example, a good enough template as to how at least their society justifies policing the liberal intolerance paradox so that it can preserve its own fundamental openness, so that people can be empowered and the state has the proper obligations. Obviously, the obligations on the state to maintain a healthy society within some bounds can never be guaranteed, because essentially the democracy has to be vigilant. The electorate has to actually have the requisite democratic literacy to judge the government of the day, and hopefully to care enough about moral principles to actually be a good and vigilant electorate. And, in some sense, in South Africa, we have been failed by an impoverished education system, but also essentially the lack of moral integrity within the politicians themselves, but also the institutionalized corruption of the law, which then has led into an exacerbated corruption of systemic institutionalized corruption of the law and morality. And with that corrupted, we have no even lens of diagnosing the true problem, which is essentially this institutional corruption that comes from the Constitutional Court, that has failed the Constitution and has given the toxic politics a life of itself, a free rein to indulge in this further intoxication. And you can also see that, sort of the court itself, the Constitutional Court itself, you can see the propaganda that is being leveraged against the Constitution and the Constitutional Court, from people who have arguments that are not like my arguments against the Constitutional Court is that it has indulged in this kind of ceremonial lavishing and this it has created a pageantry around morality, which, when it's not even getting the basics right, when it's not even properly defending the Constitution and fulfilling its proper constitutional mandate and duty. And so, the president of the Constitutional Court never used to be the Chief Justice, but now they want the Constitutional Court to fulfill the ceremonial role and to be there presiding over, the presidential appointments and officiating the presidential, ceremonial, the Constitutional Court should have absolutely no ceremonial function whatsoever. They are there to do a very independent job of safeguarding the Constitution. The idea that they should get involved, that they should get their hands dirty on the ceremonial pageantry is part of the travesty that we suffer from now, because they care more about the appearance of things and not about the substance. It should be the Chief Justice should be the president, or I don't know the exact technical term, but it should be essentially the in some sense the traditional leader or the traditional figurehead of the most senior judge in the appellant division. The Chief Justice should preside where the procedural rigor of the justice system is meant to preside. The Constitutional Court does not deal with all matters of law. It deals with constitutional law, and which is the supreme law of the land, but there are many matters which are dealing with settled constitutional issues. And that is who should preside over the ceremonies of swearing in executive officers and I don't want to see the Constitutional Court president next to politicians. Why are they rubbing shoulders with politicians? It's an utter disgrace what has been done to the constitutional framework of South Africa in this disgusting and stupid imitation of the American legal system and the American constitutional framework, which is far inferior and pathetic and corrupt. And we have imported the importation of that corruption so that we could facilitate essentially political corruption and moral corruption when we had a far superior system that has been sacrilegiously these issues of sacrilege, I guess, is perhaps slightly unwieldy to use slightly religious terms, but there was a very special thing about South Africa before this institutionalized corruption where the law was properly independent of politics. It was properly superior to politics, and it was done, it was finished, it was standalone, and the law was the supreme law of the land was in fact the final arbiter and the true ruler of the country was the law itself, so that we would finally end the curse of the false prophet, which affects society in this way, is that when you live in a democracy that is not a constitutional supreme, which is not prone to a true republic that is founded, that has its justice founded in constitutional supremacy. Justice must be founded in constitutional supremacy. Justice must live in the republic, not in the democracy. It must be independent of the democracy. Otherwise, you can never sustain a liberal, open democracy, because it will always be beholden to whatever project the democracy wants to get up to, and it will be able to infringe on the intolerance paradox and create strange paradoxes and contradictions, and then try to get out of itself with just more rationalization and semantic game playing and doubling down on its own corrupt intrinsic corruption that it has built into its foundation. South Africa had solved all of these problems because the tradition of the law in South Africa was already complete in principle and independent of politics, so much so that even during apartheid, the courts stood up against Parliament and said, what are you trying to do here? On the grounds in which what existed in the law was capable of staying independent of politics. Now we have more grounds because we actually finished the project by having a supreme constitution that had more values in it, so that justice could become properly independent and could become our ruler. And so we would not live under a sovereign parliament. We lived under a sovereign constitution. For the first time in the world, there was the rule of law. The proper rule of law. Not a system of due process that could be re-semantically configured by the democracy, but that the values were pristine and were enough to sustain themselves and conserve themselves independent of politics entirely. And this is how the curse of the false prophet then becomes lifted, is that there is no more political argument about the law. The law is settled, and the law is settled in principle, it might not be settled in terms of the legal tests that still need to be derived and tested and perhaps argued about. There is still work in the law in terms of refinement, but in principle the law is complete, and the law therefore is a law of general application. But how corruption set in was that, and you must remember how many times Nelson Mandela would not sign legislation because he says this does not fit the rule of law. This is not a law of general application. So he wouldn't sign it, and he would send it to the Constitutional Court, and they would say, yes, this does not meet with a law of general application. But that standard was infringed on, and now we have continued down that corrupt line because the Constitutional Court can't even get its first duty right, laws of general application and the rule of law. So instead we go back to relying on democracy to be the solution to everything, and we have a dishonest democracy, because now we don't instead say that the government is bad at delivering because they have made false promises. Instead we say, oh, the system is wrong. So the system needs to be radically reformed. The politics of the government is correct and their ideology is correct, but the whole system is not facilitating their success. Therefore, the system is wrong. They are never wrong. It's a complete inversion of normative standards and morality. It's a complete is that no. These people and their sentiments and their ideology must be right. Never mind. So because the law has conceded to these disgusting politicians with their disgusting racialism, democracy itself has lost the actual reference point at which to judge if governments are just bad governments, or if the problem is that the system needs to be radically reorientated towards this new fascistic form of politics and this corrupted form of politics, which the law itself has already made room for in the institutionalized corruption of the constitutional jurisprudence. For example, the creation of the governmental prerogative and not using the subclauses in the constitutional limitations clause. The shirking and the abrogation of that fundamental duty that the Constitutional Court judges have done to give room for a toxic politics of democratic illiteracy and scapegoating. Because their first idolatry is this ideology, and this is the ideology of the false prophet. In some sense, identity politics is thematically or archetypally, it is in some sense the false prophet is everywhere. The spirit of the false prophet influences many, many different things. It influences many, many wrong-headed decisions, bad forms of thinking and bad patterns of contemplation. And people must, on their individual level, be free to do this in their lives until they can grow up and mature and perhaps develop some self-knowledge about themselves. But when this is done in the realm of politics, when this is done in the realm of leadership in a democracy, this really gives too much room to the spirit of the false prophet, because essentially people will say, well, we need to go down this political road. We need to follow this program to see where it leads us. Because maybe this ideology, maybe the leader of this political party, maybe he is one of the prophets, is he not? Is this king not one of the prophets? When you keep on asking yourself, is the king one of the prophets? Then you are stuck in a transfixion. You're stuck with a question. Where are we headed? Where are we being leaded to? because we are ruled by this king. And who deserves to be king? Is he one of the prophets? How can we have a king if he is not one of the prophets? So we must ask, is he one of the prophets? The only solution to this is to end the question, because we know that we are ruled not by the king, or that the king that we are ruled by is the rule of law. Because then we have a true answer to the question, that the law is not a prophet. The law is just a double-edged sword. It is just an even judge, and it conserves itself, and it is not the justice of God, but it is a conservative justice that is capable of sustaining itself, and it's capable of being a model for personal development. If by just understanding the rule of law, you can use that as a reference point, as a mirror of accountability, to look at yourself and to look at your reflection of yourself in that mirror. Not because it is a perfect mirror that has a perfect reflective surface, but it is symbolic of something like a clear view of yourself. So, secular justice is not going to be divine justice. It's not going to be perfect justice. It's not going to solve all of your personal developmental problems in your life. But it can, in principle, be a model of the correct way. And if you remove the toxic political football, if you remove the curse of the spirit of the false prophet from politics, then at least it can only exist in people's individual personal lives. And then they can grow and take responsibility and eventually see themselves as being accountable for perhaps attaining to their own more personal delineation of what justice means. But those personal delineations of justice cannot be implanted within a secular state. But they can be exchanged within soft cultural structures. They can be exchanged within the discussion of religion. They can be exchanged within an interest and a passion and an exchange of moral philosophy. That is the realm of morality, is not to be imposed by the state, but it is to be investigated by free, liberal individuals. And the idea that some fascists want to implant their toxic ideology into the state, and they want to corrupt the state and try to make a king that will be representative of the vindication that they want to see imposed on the world. Well, those are intolerant fascists. And although that they might always come with sweet promises, and they might always say that, oh, we do it because we love these people that are being downtrodden and we're fighting for the underdog, well, that's what Hitler said. Hitler also said he was fighting for the underdog. That is what they always say. They always concoct sympathetic reasoning and rationalization. But it's ungrounded reasoning. It's grounded in an external locus of validation. It's fundamentally grounded in self-disempowerment as well. Because in principle it says that empowerment comes from the outside. That dignity is never intrinsic. It must be bestowed by some token representation. And then they can use that token representation to do whatever they like and post hoc rationalize it afterwards and create semantic games as to why that's the reasonable interpretation. And it is always an abrogation of the rule of law. It is always a destruction of rules of general application and laws of general application or standards of general application. It is always a use of double standards. And that is primarily what the Constitution is a bulwark against, the implementation of double standards. The rule of law is properly substantiated with enough values and enough moral stricture within the Constitution that these things are independently guarded against until this role was shirked, until this function was superseded by some political machination. And the Constitutional Court now is a shell of its former glory and a shell of its former self. It is essentially populated by politically partisan ideological hacks that have been implanted there to institutionally corrupt the law and to continue to preside over an institutionally corrupted realm. We live in a fallen democracy, and the question is, can it be resurrected? Can it be reborn? Can it be brought back? And it can only be brought back when someone is willing to actually openly state this truth. And, well, in some sense, it's a horrible thing to say that the one thing that is true about the American system is that, and this is a truth that they kind of wasted their constitutional supremacy on. I mean, what's the point of making a supreme constitution if you say that the democracy has full reign to amend it however the fuck they wish to do so? Then you don't have a supreme constitution. You just have a demagoguery, or you have a majority. Then what does the constitution mean? It means that it's a popularity contest, essentially. It means that that's all it's reducible to, is a fucking popularity contest. There's no accountability to it. But I mean, this is true even in the terminology that the Americans use about themselves. They are a democratic republic. I mean, what the fuck does that even mean? It's a republic or it's a democracy. It can't be a hybrid. It's a hybridization of both. So what the fuck does that mean? It means it's confused. It's not a republic. It's not a proper republic. Or, to be more specific in my critique, justice is not defined by the republic, it's defined by the democracy, which means it's a travesty of the rule of law. It will never have the rule of law. It is always the rule of man. Now, this is how it is de facto always true. It is de facto in some sense always true that we always have to work around the rule of man, because even if on paper a system is pristine and has everything correct, it can still be utterly betrayed by people who just collectively ignore it and collectively supersede it because they decide to collectively ignore it. So in some sense, you could say, well, we are always at the mercy of the rule of man, because man can always just kind of indulge in self-deception and irresponsibility and, let's say, unshackle itself from having a proper substantiated understanding, unshackle itself from basic reasoning and fundamental common sense. That's always possible. And so, but just because that's always possible doesn't mean that you should try to invent a system that accounts for that. It's impossible to account for that. If you try to account for that, then you give up all civilization. You give up all possibility of good hope and a good faith. There's no such thing as good faith then if you're trying to cover your base on that basis. If you try to create a system to try to argue against that kind of nihilism, then you are arguing from a point at which you have already conceded to nihilism nihilism is not dignified. So I mean, this is the thing. If you and this is why people in identity politics love the sympathy grifting, because essentially they are trying to say, no, people who don't have any intrinsic dignity because they have disposed of their own dignity intrinsically, and they are actually, I contend that they are blameworthy for the dignity that they have disposed of. That when they have done such a thing, they do not deserve to be bestowed dignity by a system. A system must not come and supplement and give them a substitute for their own lack of dignity which they have disposed of. No, the only way to give them dignity is to blame them for their own betrayal of intrinsic dignity. You cannot dignify someone who is fundamentally self-impugning. They cannot indulge in the hysteria of their own lack of morality and then try to redefine that lack of morality as the new morality that everyone must orientate themselves around. No. That is the game of a fascist, in fact. That is the game of a fascist. That's the game of thinking that, well, one rationalization is as good as any other rationalization. They all have equal dignity. No. And you really have to, liberal openness gives you the freedom of association and the freedom of contract to disassociate yourself from such people. Yes, you can't stop them in their personal capacity. You should stop them from taking over the state. You should stop them from taking over institutions, and from, because institutions need to accord to constitutional values and principles. But instead, this has all been institutionally corrupted to make room for this poisonous ideology that is fundamentally disempowering of itself, as it continues to use that point as a spear against anyone who stands in their way of more radical corruption and more radical moral corruption. Well, this is how I envision myself as a somewhat of a strange esoteric reincarnation, and I mean that figuratively, of Blackstone. That essentially to have a stable liberal legal order and legal theory and legal tradition, to have a justified structure of rules and standards, because at some point Noam Chomsky is correct in something that I don't hear him saying. In fact, he's given up on this, I think, but he used to say this a long time ago, that power is I can't remember the exact word, but power needs to justify power. If you exert power and you exert essentially, if you impose an order, any system of power that imposes itself or imposes a structure, it is on them to provide a substantial. It is for them to properly substantiate the imposition of the order or the power, because at some point there is always an imposition. That's what life is. Even every breath is an imposition on the world in some way. There must be a substantiated understanding at some point, and that's not to say that it must necessarily be agreed on even by a majority of people. There's a huge scope for huge major disagreements within a liberal order in the personal realm. But just because other people have got a rational argument doesn't mean that it's coherent enough or reasonable enough to destroy property rights or destroy freedom of contract or freedom of association. All of these things are hugely under siege and under threat. The basic liberal order is in complete disarray, essentially, and we were so close, essentially, to having a society that had the proper morality that it could actually... I mean, we literally had a space-aged civilization on paper, but it was fundamentally betrayed. But essentially that betrayal all comes out of a kind of immorality. And you could say that, yes, people were also misled, because, I guess America is an example that a lot of people like to follow, and what is fashionable in America is worthy, But at some point, this is all a useful opportunity in history. At some point, the world has to stand still, and the spirit of man needs to comport itself into a safe order, a safe structure that is capable of properly managing its development. Because it is the spirit of man that precipitates the Son of Man. It is the spirit of man that is the perennial thing that must be understood to have a proper understanding of morality. And this is a personal journey of that people must grow into, and they must. But it is much easier when you have a justice system that at least has the same fundamental structure as principled thinking, because then at least you have a model of how principled thinking works, even if it isn't the perfect principle. Secular, liberal, open democracy will never have perfect principles, will never have divine principles, but at least if it has principles that are capable of reproducing themselves, if capable of conserving their own substance, independently of politics, independently of kingship, of the rule of man, then at least we have removed the most toxic element of the spirit of man, of its pretense to give itself dignity that it never deserved, which is what happens when you create the slave morality of a collective ideology, which is never right and never wrong, and it's always the system that must comport with it and follow the doubling down rationalizations as it sloppily moves on to always just being on the right side of history or something like that. It's a lazy, unaccountable, fascistic volatility. And liberalism has not been perfected until South Africa. Until the South African Constitution combined with the legal theory in South Africa that already existed, which was the best example of any legal system in the world. The substantive law in South Africa was in principle complete. Therefore, it already had the experience and the tradition of having some procedural understanding in how to practice the rule of law. It had a lot of rigor built into its structure that was very much like a proper rule of law. But it wasn't complete because it didn't have enough values and principles. In fact, it always relied on the mores of society in combination with essentially the parliament being the voice of public policy, because public policy was always an interpretive leg within the Roman Dutch substantive legal structure. When everything needed to be interpreted, when anything was slightly needed to be open to interpretation, it went with the mores of society, it went with public policy. But now we have a structure to that public policy, and that structure is the Supreme Constitution. Only it has been betrayed by the Constitutional Court. And that is a crime against humanity that must at some point be recognized or come to an end. We need a truth and reconciliation around it. I am not a punitive person. For me, it is more important that the truth of it be discovered than punishment be done because of it. But we do need to fix these broken institutional pieces that have been scattered and dispersed in the wreckage of what was well, I can only describe it with adjectives, and it doesn't really mean anything. This is a space-aged model of civilization and governmental framework. A justice that, although not divine justice, is congruent and compatible with individuals that can attain towards proper morality. But instead, they try to strangle the baby in its crib. The wickedness of evil men and evil women with wicked souls and wicked spirits, who their only excuse is that they have band together with other miscreants and other evil people to solidify their cause into a legion of doom that spells the threat against what was really the best the world had to offer, as they insulted it with really quite a twisted and evil contrivance of, the things that they said about Mandela. They said, I'm somewhat paraphrasing, but, essentially, they called it Madiba magic. They said, we don't want this Madiba magic. We want to be fascists. We want to be the people that apartheid treated us as if we were truly. There are so many interesting parallels here about the evilness of people who should have known better because of their own history. I mean, this kind of willful evilness, I think, is it is the spirit of the false prophet in almost its most purest form. Because at least in World War II, at least the Nazis didn't have the benefit of history of knowing about the Nazis. They didn't have the benefit of the South African Constitution. The Nazis, when they were doing what they were doing, there was they were experimenting openly. And they were being subversive and radical against a liberal order that was younger and less developed and less rigorous and less morally experimented with. All of these experiments now have occurred. And we came up with a truly rigorous and accountable way in which we could actually have justified systems of power. And we achieved that in South Africa. And instead of using that structure of transparency to have a clean political development, instead they destroyed that system of accountability so that they could continue with their corruption. Instead of having the corruption become the real political issue, they scapegoated it onto the system of accountability. And even the people who seemingly argue about this are always ambiguous about the abrogation in the morality of non-racialism. And they do so out of necessity of popularity, because it is too unfashionable to be a non-racialist. If anything happens to this society, whatever happens to it, I just think that whatever happens, it truly deserves what happens to it, and that is I think at the end of the day, when you look at the voting, if you look at the electorate, that's well, if you don't bootstrap accountability onto the rule of man for its own corruption, then when does it ever expend itself into refutation? I guess that sounds like a sympathy rationalization argument, but in some sense, true condemnation only comes from epistemic agency, and I make it on the foundation of my own positive substantiation. It is eminently unreasonable, it is eminently incoherent, the corruption that we are suffering from. And at the end of the day, I think the judges do hold the most important role in being the guardians and being the guardian class of this form of civilization, and they have failed. They have abysmally failed. And that is not only a crime against the South African Constitution, I say in a higher way, it is a crime against humanity as well. It is in fact a deep crime against humanity, because what South Africa had to offer the world as a model, as a beacon, as a fire that would in future be the fire that lit the altar, the unlit altar of the American, because we also do inherit some things from America. We must pay some historical due that the evolution of our liberal theory that our Constitution is framed from is informed by the American experiment, and this experiment is an ungodly experiment. It's also it's an unjustified experiment, but it was historically necessary, because you needed an experimentation to prove to the spirit of man, to create enough of this perpetual lawlessness and injustice of what I will generally call the American troll. You know, Americans are often a kind of amoralistic in their trolling. When they talk about morality, they are just, because in their view, justice is all about, well, do you have a rationalization that sounds good? They don't have coherent, principled, substantive reasons. They fix problems as they arise. If something happens and it seems to be unjust, then they run back to the state legislature or to the federal legislature, and they try to fix the problem with new law, with new promulgations of law. They displace the law all the time. There are no laws of general application in America. The same law is in force according to due process, but that law can be repealed and repromulgated. The law is always changing in America. The substantive law in America is principally incomplete, and it is principally experimented on by the democracy. This means that you must regard, in the American system, you must regard that the democracy is your prophet. That the will of the collective will of the people through its representatives, and how it makes the law and how it makes its governance, must be in some sense a kind of, they act as a prophet for the society. When democracy is your king, you are cursed with the question, are the people, or are the people's representatives, or are the leader of the people, are they one of the prophets? The question itself is a toxic question. The question itself must come to an end, so that accountability can properly rest in the individual sphere and not in the collective political sphere of dramatization, so that we can grow up as individuals and not try to collectively solve problems and collectively grow up. There are some issues that can be collectively facilitated, but they can only be facilitated by a system that has proper accountability and that has proper checks and balances. And due process is not a proper check and balance when you are just constantly doubling down and repromulgating the law, and there are no laws of general application. Law of general application means that in principle, something is in force and it is always in force. You might derive different legal tests, but the principles are in stone. They are done. They are finished. And that has been the great lineage of the South African legal tradition, because it is fundamentally convened around that there must be an understanding, and that understanding can be refined in practice, but the principles and its philosophical components can all be laid down before. That was what we inherited. In fact, I mean, this is why the British, when they took over South Africa, they did not remove the substantive law in South Africa because they knew that it was superior to their own. The British were very interesting colonizers. They would not displace what worked. If something worked well, they wouldn't just change it to their own. They wouldn't just force compliance with their way of doing things if they couldn't reason that it should be, if they in fact reasoned that it was an inferior movement or change to make. The only legal tradition in the world that still has the Roman Dutch, which was essentially a very rare legal system of how the Roman law was recovered and received into Christian Holland. The Christian reception of the Roman law is the Roman Dutch system. And it was destroyed in Europe itself. It was displaced by the Napoleonic law codes, which were essentially following the American example. Napoleon was almost a kind of an acolyte of the American experiment. And anyway, let me not talk about inferior systems too much. But I mean, this is why continental Europe is, I mean, at least the British liberal order, and through Blackstone, has some rigor and some integrity, but it's somewhat imprecise, and it's not done consciously. It's somewhat done in the mythology of their structure, which is almost the kind of, I mean, again, this was also the inspiration of the American system, was the British constitutional arrangement. Anyway, these historical insights are perhaps not that useful to talk about that much. Just to talk about the topic a bit, I just expanding it into those things. Okay, this is a bit of an addendum, just to go into the point, because I wanted to make a recording that I was going to title something like "The American Injustice and the American Troll," or American, and I mean that kind of as a kind of archetypal thing, because I see this. Look, I mean, to some reason, you can't criticize America too much, although I do, because I want power structures to be justified in substantiating their imposition of order on things. And if they don't try to have a justified system, then it's never going to be properly rigorous. It's never going to be properly reasoned and susceptible to challenges that is going to create enough transparency and accountability within that power structure. And simply relying on democracy as the final arbiter of everything is, although that they can, I've already stated the kind of de facto force of argument to that, it's a terrible thing to waste a constitution into endorsing, because then what's the point of having a constitution? I mean, it essentially is just there saying that the democracy can do whatever the fuck it wants anyway, because it even has the power to change the constitution itself, essentially. It's not a constitutional republic. It's just a democracy that and the republic is rented space from the democracy until the democracy wishes to actually cancel or section out the constitution. If all the constitution does is set up the democracy as being sovereign and the final arbiter of everything, then why even have it? Essentially, because it's just a food fight. It's just a free-for-all anyway. And the idea that democracies themselves are not prone to forms of self-deception or self-delusion or forms of corruption, which they obviously are, means that it would be better to have a system of power that imposes its order in a way that can be substantiated and justified, so that then you have a proper interface of accountability and transparency and all these sorts of things. And it obviously goes very nicely with a democracy then, an open democracy that stays open and accountable to reason in some sense, or just general good, robust, proper democratic literacy and debate, and an internal discussion or negotiation. Anyway, so my point is that America doesn't have that. That would be something like the gold standard. Instead, what America has is it has an impoverished view of what justice can mean. It has reduced justice not into something that is principled, but into something that is fundamentally a popularity contest. And it's premised in consensus. It's premised in, well, it's reasonable enough because enough people gave it democratic legitimacy, or sort of gave representatives a mandate to do it. Therefore, it's worthy to be imposed and called justice. But that is to undermine the very nature of the essence of justice itself, is to turn justice into rationalization. And I mean, this is why I've never liked American law, because you really, it's different in every state. You have to go into a state and you have to know exactly, in some sense, you have to become, you have to localize your morality into the idiom which is contained within whatever rationalization that they have, because essentially they'll have a certain set of defaults, a certain set of presumptions, the rational construction, because it's not based in principle, will be based essentially in a certain sense of which expectations take legal priority over other expectations, and you have to acclimatize yourself to that interpretation of how things should work. So you have to always acclimatize yourself into how essentially the majority thinks things should work. And if you can convince other people, if you can convince the majority that things should work this way or some other way, that is the definition of justice in America. Essentially, it is fundamentally contrived within what is essentially the rule of the rule of man. And then they call it the rule of law because they say, well, we have due process. And that in some sense is what their constitution actually guarantees and enshrines, is something like due process. And so, which is not the same as a proper law of general application, because they do have laws of general application in the particular facet of that at any moment the same law will be implied within the same jurisdiction. That there will be procedural fairness, but in terms of the substance, there is no such thing as fairness. In terms of the substance of the law, it can be repealed or repromulgated or reinvented at the behest of the majority, at the behest of the moving, evolving consensus in the democracy. So justice is a rented space that is rented from the democracy, and democracy is the landlord of the justice in America. This is uncivilized. This is why America is so corrupt fundamentally, although that corruption is held within a kind of developmental moment. It's interesting that if you were going to create a stable experimental petri dish to experiment towards the concept of proper law and transparency, if you did want to evolve it from the ground up, that you would perhaps have to create a constitutional structure around some important or significant psychological moment in terms of that involved an issue of developing maturity. And it just so happens that that psychological moment, that developmental moment that the American system is crafted around, is quite an abstract philosophical contention, or quite an abstract philosophical obstacle to development, which is essentially in the importance of delineating the difference between rationalization and coherent reasoning, and justified understandings and justified reasoning. And in some sense, just as all the founding fathers, many of them said in their slightly different ways, that the American system is only suitable for a moral population. The form of government that America has is only deserving, or is only decent, if essentially the people themselves are collectively decent, which is itself, I think, a very strange thing to try to hedge your bet on, that somehow the lowest common denominator, the general consensus on what goodness is and what decency will amount to be, can be sort of, and you can then also understand why then it would make sense to limit the vote to people who have, in some sense, material investments into the society, so as to, in the same way that the reason why I think that my legal tradition is so excellent and so good is because it was invented by aristocrats who used the law against each other. It was invented by a system of very elite people who needed a double-edged sword. They needed a sophisticated way to make claims against each other, but also to defend those claims against each other. So there was a lot of philosophical focus and a lot of intellectual rigor that was put into creating a system that actually is coherent, that actually works. And I mean, the Roman law was the envy of any empire in all the world for its, the concept of the Roman Republic. Even when there was a tyrant, there was a certain weight, there was a certain virtue that the concept of the Republic brought, and often the tyrants themselves thought it a great shame to impose tyranny, and to derivate from the ideal that the Republic represented. And that they took it over always reluctantly, and with a kind of curse that came along with it, that is somewhat played out a little bit in history. But and you can see then that there is perhaps this theme of the problem of kingship and the problem of having kings and rulers, and the question of are they one of the prophets, or are they a true prophet, or are they a false prophet? And what I've really tried to say is that the general solution to this is that the question must stop, because the question must be answered. The only way the question stops is if you answer the question in the negative. You say, no, the king is not one of the prophets, because the king is the rule of law. The king is like an insect. It's just a mechanism of transparency and accountability, and it's not a perfect gauge of these things, because what is a better gauge of these things is an individual personal opinion and understanding, but that is not something that the law is capable of fully vindicating. That is something that can only be vindicated in your own estimation of your own opinion, and I guess according to your own purposes. And, if you really think that you've got a good polemic or a good point to make, then share it with people, like I am sharing mine now. Spread it, or something like that, or offer it to other people, or something like that, to consider and to think about. Convince other people of it if it's an opinion that you want. If it's in line with your purpose, to spread it, and it's not a secret or something like that. I guess it depends how much you care to share in teaching, or to share in understanding, and to have a shared life, and a helpful life, perhaps, and the happiness that comes with helping other people, perhaps. And if that resonates with your character or not. There are certainly many other sorts of characters in the world, and other sorts of motivations, and other sorts of, and we cannot just be blind to these things. And in some sense, this is why I argue, in some sense, to the end of this political game of being trolled by politics that seeks to morally grandstand against the system itself, and scapegoat things onto the system, rather than playing its proper role that it has been assigned by the proper supreme law that is the king, that is just a mechanism that ensures accountability and transparency. And then it's essentially up to the electorate to choose what government they want to choose. And if they want to completely dissolve the Constitution, then they must do so. Then someone must campaign on that mandate, or campaign on that manifesto, and achieve that mandate to then completely remove the Constitution and start something else, if they want to, which is, effectively what the Nazis did. But the Nazis didn't have much of an ideological fight, because although they were fighting against the liberals of their day, liberalism was not, in Germany, I would say, perhaps I shouldn't speak too much outside of my historical awareness and of the actual facts, but I would think that South Africa is in a very different historical position, which makes everything that we're going through incredibly ironic to a large degree. And we are all the more morally culpable for our depravity in this country. And I mean that as I attach that to the electorate. I do blame the electorate for the condition of the country. And you must do so, otherwise you don't live in a democracy of any variety. Although I have stated that we are not a democracy, we are a constitutional republic foremost. But in some sense, it is the judge's fault that framework has slid. But anyway, sorry, I'm repeating my previous recording. Let me just go back to America. So, perhaps the reason why I go through these things over and over again is because I'm trying to show at least the failing of the American structure, the failing of the American system. And I do actually think that America is what I think it is, historically, and it was invented like this on purpose, because it was not meant to be the beacon of liberty. It was meant to be the altar of liberty, and that altar has not yet been lit in fact, and that is in fact the secret of the phoenix on the emblem of America, on the coat of arms of America, which is not an eagle originally, it is a phoenix. But instead then it was replaced with an eagle, and do you know what eagles do to their young? It's quite disgusting. Eagles will actually, the young, if they are seen to be weak, they will be discarded from the nest. They, what's the word? What's the word? Eugenics. Eagles practice eugenics, essentially. And I guess they do so because they have good eyesight. And so I guess at some point it was a selective advantage to evolve that keen ability to perceive, and perhaps to perceive weakness and to preen that weakness based on the surrounding conditions, or based on what has been rationalized as collectively good to be an eagle, and what is bad in an eagle, so that you can then have a metric against which you can practice eugenics. And anyway, but I'm trying to make a link between the use of rationalizations and collective morality and the behavior of eagles in how they treat their young. Anyways, maybe it's a bit of a tenuous thematic link there, but anyway, so my general point is that at some point this altar should be lit by the true flame, and then it will sort of be complete. And I don't think that this altar needs to be lit in any other way other than I do think in some sense America was invented by its forefathers to be a test, to be an experiment, which is also a test, but also an ingredient towards the end of the experiment. And that test is something of the test of the spirit of man, or a proper understanding of the spirit of man, which was being experimented through the American project. And when that project was emulated by Napoleon and tried to be concocted in a less experimental form, and in a more solid and crystallized structure, then we got the Napoleonic corruption. But that Napoleonic corruption is also what America suffers from, but on a more distributed scale, on a cultural level. So in some sense, the Napoleonic corruption infected the leadership, the political leadership of continental Europe, essentially, as the Napoleonic structure of government and constitutional framework. The Napoleonic law codes imposed justice on people from the top down, from an enlightened sovereign parliament that then could just construct the structure of the republic with a sentimental set of values and promises and ideology. And then in the name of that, they could always just repromulgate and reinstitute structures and change the law in a kind of hodgepodge way, in an ad hoc way, to fix over the cracks and to create new, essentially that the only rights that you have in continental Europe are the rights that you are awarded by government preemptively, whereas Britain and America has more of the common law tradition, which is far superior in at least attaining to the liberal ideal of freedom, is that you have whatever right you may claim, except those which are obviated by the sovereign government and the sovereign power. And so you have a measure of sovereignty in your personal capacity to the extent to which that it has not already been detracted from you or negated by the other sovereign power, which is essentially the collective. Now, I believe that this collective power needs to be policed by proper accountability and proper checks and balances, not just majoritarian democracy, but by the standards of a liberal, open democracy that is capable of guarding against the liberal intolerance paradox, which requires an independent basis of justice, which I've gone through, America does not have. Instead, it has a contest of rationalization. Contestations and people contending claims, all based on rationalizations. And in some sense, if you're not dealing with somebody else's rationalization with a rationalization that draws on the same measure of sympathy and the same measure of sentimental investment that the population has, then you just kind of fall by the wayside in the truncated argument that rationalization generally leads to, because it doesn't have principles to be coherent within. It's kind of already abandoned these things. And it's easy to do so when the system never had proper principles in place in the first place. And in fact, the biggest principle in the American Declaration, apart from the ideological promises of unadulterated tyranny, in some sense, the American governmental experiment was really premature because it was fundamentally premised in being anti-tyranny. And you can't create a civilization based on negative values. You can't say, we hate tyranny, that's our value. No. You have to define freedom and liberty. And that was never done properly. It was done ideologically. It was done as a promise. It was done as, here are these amendments, here are these Bill of Rights. What do they mean? How do we really safeguard them? Well, the judge will always interpret what's going on, and the judge will largely give the rule, the right of way to the state. Essentially, the judge, in fact, is encouraged to be on the side of the democracy, because that is the more prime interest that in fact the American form of government was centered around protecting, was the right of rule, of self-determination of a population. So in some sense, the collective is fundamentally overprivileged against the individual and against proper rule of law and accountability. And so this is the inheritance of, this is the American children, which I call trolls. These are the sons and daughters of liberty, is this kind of injustice that is premised in rationalization and argumentation and raising contentions that aren't properly reasoned from principles, from first principles, because they were never first principles there to begin with. And obviously we can all have our own individual principles, and we can also engage in discussion and argumentation over which principles are more important than other principles, and in terms of making sure that you are actually going to be able to be capable of reasoning them in any kind of coherent way, or something like that. But and how you get into problems if you just have the right principles but in the wrong order, or something like that. Or in the wrong order of priority. in terms of when you are trying to give I don't know how to say it, give utilization of one principle to the detriment of another principle. And you might need other principles or values in order to reason out how these things can be made, let's say, compatible in a way that is morally coherent to the right priority of principles. And there are certainly illegitimate methodologies of reasoning, I think, or incoherent ways of reasoning that need to be, and in some sense, that's a kind of reasoning on that kind is a kind of experiential wisdom, and that's something that we can all sort of grow in. In some sense, we can access our principles via our reasoning, and that can be something that we can always be refined and quickened and grown up in doing, so that we might generally have the same principles, maybe a few added ones, but how we access them, how we utilize them it becomes quite sophisticated. How we channel them, rather, or embody them, becomes almost by its nature, these intimate details about people's characters and their moral character is by its very nature complex. The human condition is complex, life is complex, and the wading through these mysteries and resolving these mysteries into a proper understanding, I think, is the general, is the only course to take. Otherwise, one is just sort of treading water in rationalization. Maybe going from rational debris that you are sort of using as a pontoon to keep yourself afloat to the next rationalization or next piece of debris that you use to fulfill the same. Anyway, what was I saying? Yeah, I wanted to talk about that developmental moment. So yeah, I mean, this is what I've been kind of getting into, is that the moments when one says rationalization is actually not a mark of coherence. It's a mark of self-coherence, but self-coherence, it's a mark of self-consistency, not a mark of self-coherence. Self-coherence can only be seen after self-consistency is further qualified. You can't just be your understanding can't just be rational. It also has to be coherent, and coherence needs a separate, independent pedigree of reasoning, of independently reasoned things, and that requires first principles, which in some sense have to be chosen. You have to choose your principles, and you have to stand by your choice, and that is how you actually have the dignity of agency. People who don't have principles, by definition, cannot have dignity. And I would safeguard that we perhaps don't, prelingual infants that cannot speak. I would be very I would really caution a huge amount of doubt if you think that these young individuals don't have principles just because they cannot communicate them. Just because they cannot communicate in human language, and they are certainly ruled by the biological passions of the body, is just because you can't get them to mouth the words principles and to understand the difference between a qualification and these sorts of things, I think do not believe that children do not have some prime mental grammar of a categorical way in which these things hold water in their phenomenological experience. I do think that the agent is on some level an incarnated biological machine, but this machine essentially comes together. It starts before it comes together, but it comes together probably, I think, at around the 4-month mark, where the spark of understanding is fully ripened, when the conception reaches a state of a unitary seed that is the mark of an individual understanding that is discerning from that grounding and standpoint. Anyway, I don't want to get too complicated, but and before then, there is perhaps even a memory of consciousness that can be recounted, but essentially until that seed ripens into that state of a discerning understanding, before then it's more like a cloud of meditating towards a conscious container that regulates its own epistemic agency. That in some sense I think that the concept of understanding is the thing that allows us to experience the world as being intelligible, and that process essentially starts from the 4-month period of being of gestation. But that doesn't mean that the distinction between the agent and the external world is properly delineated, and there's a clear distinction between the environment and the self. But it does mean that the self is, at that point, I think, established. Anyway, and I take that from a mixture of two sources. That in my own memory of being in the womb, which I can't exactly know because I wasn't measuring the passage of time, but 4 months I think seems to line up with what has, which we can also find, what is reported in the Islamic law, which I have huge reservations about its rational justification, for which there is no rational justification. In fact, it is a principle in Islamic scholarship that Islamic law can never be rationalized. In fact, it's called, I can't remember, but there is it is a kind of heresy to try to rationalize Islamic law. So in some sense it cannot be understood. But the content of it is certainly an incredibly rich and interesting source of meditation, although one is in some sense not really encouraged to rationalize or try to understand the content of the law, which that situation I find to be interesting, and it is somewhat, anyway, I don't want to, this will become a whole topic on itself, which I don't want to stray into too many different directions. Anyway, I think, yeah, so anyway, I was just trying to get into this developmental moment when people essentially, because there's one thing to actually have an understanding. There's another thing to understand that you have an understanding. Is not the same thing. And to understand that you have an understanding in some sense is also to know something about the quality of what an understanding is. And that is a kind of developmental moment in which one must distinguish between rationalization and self-coherence. And knowing that self-consistency is not as good as self-coherence, is not the same as self-coherence. And having an ear to listening to people based on, well, is he making a stand based on purely rationality, based on pure self-consistency, or is he trying to make a broader substantiation that has coherence within it? And is his version of coherence compatible with my version of coherence? Because there might be other kind of coherent positions which maybe are coherent in the treatment of some subject matter and some issues, but are not really optimal phenomenological schemas. Groupthink would be one of these things. You could make a weak argument for a kind of, in some sense I wouldn't think that it would be a proper self-coherence, because in some sense you would be displacing self-coherence for worldly coherence or group coherence or collective coherence. And how would you even ground that? Because you can only ground it from a subjective point of view, from a subjective individual point of view. So if you don't have self-coherence first, how can you even endorse a concept like collective coherence? It's fundamentally untenable. It's almost it's paradoxical. It's oxymoronical. So, and this is what we deal with when we deal with people that are just plying rationalization, is they are often trying to dignify their oxymoronical stupidity. And they are usually doing so by relying on semantic arguments, on the connotations of words, of their unilateral subjective interpretation, because they're not listening to the coherence that is being communicated from other people and judging that coherence. They only care about the power of rationalization, and they don't want to drop that gun. They don't want to let go of that ammunition, because they can maybe use it to sadistically get their way, to dominate in a kind of unaccountable fashion, that they can, in some sense, the hope is that they can get away with their unjustified understanding. They can get away with their love of the darkness, which is another way to say the love of nescience, the love of ignorance, the love of not knowing it in your own understanding that is justified. Which is usually leveraging negative arguments. It's usually negative. It's usually trying to convene a sympathy around a common enemy. It's trying to say we are being destroyed by tyranny, therefore we are the anti-tyranny liberty crowd. And that was the kind of way in which America was founded. And I will just say that there are lots of things which I find particularly repugnant about America, which it inherited from this historical beginning. For instance, and I just mean this, this is a surface level, but this is just to make the point. When America was suing for its independence and when the revolutionary fervor was growing within the culture, do you know what the mob sometimes did? They would get a British tax collector and they would tar and feather the British tax collector. Look, I understand that symbols are important, and it's important to cultivate symbols of dissatisfaction to create a general polemic and a general activism and a. But you know how barbaric it is to tar and feather someone, especially someone who is doing their duty or doing their function. I mean, you can argue against them doing their function, but in some sense, one instead of punishing them, perhaps you could just send them packing. Perhaps you could eject them. But to tar and feather them, do you know how sadistic you have to? I mean, that's psychopathic. But psychopathy is often dignified by the sentiment of the crowd, by the collective rationalization, by the collective coherence in substitute of the self-coherence. Evilness is disguised and covered up. And so I would just like to say that this is the moral corruption which America inherited because it was founded within its. I mean, you must also remember, and there are some quaint things that you can say that this made their system better, is that you understand that if you went to court in America in those days of the revolution, that advocates or lawyers talking in court, they would argue based on the coins that you would siphon into their pouches that would be essentially attached to their ponytails or around their necks or something on a collar that they or attached to their robe. There was a special pocket, and to make them stand up and respond to the other person's argument, you would have to put more coins into the pocket of the advocate to speak on your behalf, to argue your case. So let us just remember that this was a time in which the issue of justice and the issue of arguing justice and arguing about justice, I mean, justice functioned like a fucking vending machine. That was the sociological experience of what justice was. You paid for justice, and at the point at which you ran out of coins to progress the argument and to develop the legal argument, the gears of justice stopped turning for you. This was the context in which people wanted freedom from tyranny, from a mean king that overtaxed his subjects. Oh, I can understand, the economic force of argument that taxation is is a limitation on one's is a limitation on one's latitude of freedom and somewhat dignity, essentially. I mean, I think that's what it centers around. But I really wonder how much of this was the dissatisfaction of the consequences of ill rule, and how much of it was actually a properly formulated. Look, I mean, obviously, it's very. You can always criticize people for not being more intelligent, for not being more properly principled in the cases that they make, in the prosecution of their claim toward a better life. But if we just relent into sympathy grabbing and we end up with a system that respects sympathy grabbing, then you never have integrity. You just have a kind of lowest common denominator ideological trust that is based essentially on a kind of trigger, on a kind of leverage that can always be used and pulled in order to affect corruption upon corruption. And anyway, I guess in a convoluted way, I'm just trying to put a window onto the time and onto that. These were perhaps people that were not ready to invent a justice system and a system of government. And as indeed the people themselves did not invent their system, it was invented by an intellectual elite, the federal, what is it called? The Federalist Papers, the publishing of the conference, and the Madison, and all the speeches and the discussion. And there was, I believe, one of them, I think it was Madison, who said some really cynically and egregious things as well, but he was not an unintelligent person, and he was also investigating the subject matter himself, and I think he called out to some scholar or some academic, not in the Federalist Papers. I'm talking about, I don't know where this comes from, but I think I am historically informed in this, but he, for some reason, I have this very stark impression that he investigated with a scholar as to a philosophical argument, and he investigated democracy in the Greek civilization and the Greek experience. And he had some questions which he asked someone to go and investigate and find the answers to that, and to go and read some things and report back to him. And when that was done, and that was done too late, that was done after the Federalist Papers were already compiled, he realized that the form of government that he had helped to structure and lay down in the discussion and in the argumentations were actually suboptimal, and that there was a different way to go. But even in that aftermath, that Madison still reconciled that America was doing an honest thing and a useful thing and a good thing, but not good in the absolute, but good in terms of history, that it would be the agent of refinement. It would be a kind of, it would not try to create a good structure from the top down. It would try to create the ingredient of a more evolved and meditated on general solution to the problem, rather than trying an experimental form of republic that might buckle under the pressure of its own newness. And so I do dignify the project, the American project, but I am forced to criticize it, and I am also forced to criticize its byproduct, which is this kind of juvenile immaturity, because people who acclimatize themselves to that conception of justice, I think, are deeply misled. Anyway, apart from my scandalous, kind of talking about history to some degree, but anyway, that's the point that I wish to draw. Let me stop this recording now. I guess I've I think fully gone over everything that there is to go over somewhat on this topic, although sadly in my usual laborious way. Anyway, I think that quite deals with all of that.